In this video, we're going to have a look at how to use the router plane. So we have here is a Veritas router plane. We've got two handles here to hold on and grip on when we're using it. We've got a locking nut here. We've got a second locking nut here. And with them loose, we can use this thumb screw here to adjust the blade height. We have the blade underneath in the middle of the sole plate here. So this blade can be adjusted to go up and down. I'm going to use this router plane now to finish taking out the waste wood from my corner halving joint and cross halving joint, which we have as part of a combination flat frame skill stick. So here we have my corner halving joint. You can see the line in here that's been made by the marking gauge. We still have some waste wood to take out here. We also have the line in here as well from the marking gauge on the cross halving, and some waste wood that needs to come out there as well, which we're going to use the router plane to remove. Where we use the router plane is normally after we've come in with our bevel edge chisel and our mallet, our wooden mallet, to take out the majority of the waste wood. What we're really looking for here is for the router plane to actually come in and take out the rest of that waste wood, making sure we get a nice, clean, flat finish right the way across these joints. I now have my material clamped into the vise, making sure my material is horizontal with the cheeks of the vise here. I can now come in and get ready to make a start taking out the waste wood on my cross halving joint here. So what I'm looking to do is to take my router plane, and I'm going to loosen off the first thumb screw here, loosen off my second thumb screw here, meaning that the thumb screw at the top here can freely move the blade up and down. I'm now going to come in with my router plane. I'm going to rest the sole on to the piece of wood, making sure the blade is in the centre of where I want the cutting to go, in the centre of my cross halving joint. I'm now going to lower down the thumb screw for the blade height. And because I've not got a lot of material to come out in this joint, I'm going to lower it right down onto the marking gauge line. If you've got quite a bit of material still to come out, you can do this in sections and take a little bit of material out at a time. So I'm quite happy I've lined up my blade. So I'm looking at the blade underneath the router plane, and I'm checking that the blade is in line with my marking gauge line. I can now come in and tighten the first thumb screw and tighten the second thumb screw. Before I make a start, I'm just placing my router plane onto the piece of wood, double checking that the blade is at the correct height that I want it at. So we can see in there that the blade is sitting at about the height where the marking gauge line was, so I'm happy with that and I'm now ready to go. Now that we've set the router plane and checked the blade height, we can now take out the rest of the waste wood. So I'm going to place the router plane onto the wood, making sure I've got a equal force on each handle, pushing down but also pushing forward. And then I'm just going to come in and I'm just going to break away parts of that waste wood that needs to come out of my cross halving joint there. And once I get to about halfway, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to take the piece of wood out of the vise, rotate the wood around, and then I'm going to do the exact same thing on this side, taking out this piece of waste wood here. The reason we rotate the wood around in the vise when we're using the router plane is because if we continued to take the waste wood out on the router plane towards this side, so if I was to continue using the router plane this way, and as that blade gets to the edge, there's a likelihood that you're going to splinter off a massive piece of wood here, and that's going to ruin the side of your nice crisp clean joint here. Okay, so I've now rotated the wood in the vise, and I now have the waste wood on this side here. So again, I can then place the router plane on and come in, equal pressure on both handles of the router plane, and work at taking away the rest of that waste wood that we need to get taken away to finish off the joint. We can now have a look at the cross halving joint end on, and we can now see that that's got a nice flat even cut right the way across the joint. It's going to make sure we get a nice square joint there. Okay, so looking at this here, maybe got a wee bit more to come off this side. So what I can do is pop it into the vise, come in again with the router plane, just double check my height, loosen off the thumb screws a little bit, lower my blade down, tighten the thumb screws up, and now come in and just work on that little bit there. It's not been quite taken down. can now see we've got a nice clean cut right the way along this cross-halving joint. We're now going to have a look at using the router plane on the corner halving. There's a slightly different technique with this, but majority the same as what you've already just seen from the cross halving. Okay, so I'm going to go through the same procedures again, same processes. I'm going to lay the router plane onto my piece of wood. I'm going to make sure the thumb screws for the locking nuts are loosened. And I'm going to check my height depth with the blade, making sure the blade is in the height of the marking gauge line. Because I've not got too much material to come out here, I'm quite happy to put it in at that depth. If you've got a bit more material to put in, I'd recommend doing this in stages, taking a little bit off at a time until you get to that depth of the marking gauge, line. So, I've heightened the blade up to where I want it to be. Quite happy with that there. I'm now going to come in and lock in the thumb screws and the locking nuts. And with the corner halving, the slight difference we have here is we've not got anywhere to rest this side of the plane onto. So if I put too much pressure on this side, we're going to get a slant onto our corner halving joint. So the technique we use here is keeping all the pressure on this one hand, and we use this other hand to rotate the blade around and cut across the wood to cut out the waste wood. So I've got pressure down on this handle here. I'm using this other handle of the plane to rotate round. So I'm ensuring that I've got all my force going through my right hand here, and I'm rotating the plane around by using my left hand, making sure that's just adding any kind of directional force and not direct force downwards into the joint, ensuring we get a nice horizontal joint that's not going to have a slant on it. Again, like the cross halving, once we get to about halfway or just over halfway, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to take the piece of wood out of the vise, rotate the piece of wood round, again making sure that the wood is horizontal in the vise, and I'm going to come in from the opposite side now, making sure that all the weight is in my left hand, pushing down onto the piece of wood, onto that flat surface, and using my right hand now to just rotate the router plane around to chip off the excess that's left on the corner halving. So now we can see, again, we've got a nice flat finish right across the corner halving, making sure we've got the rest of that waste wood out, ready to move on to the next components of our joints. When we're laying our router plane down, in between working on joints, always ensure that we lay the router plane down into the bench well like this, ensuring that the blade isn't touching the bench at any point, thus making sure that the blade doesn't get damaged. Okay, and when we're finished with the router plane, ensure that we loosen off the locking nuts here and retract the blade fully until it is within the depth of the sole plate. And once retracted, we can lock off the locking nuts with the thumb screws here, and now that can be safely laid on the bench without damaging the blade of the router plane.